that there are philosophical insights to be gained from every one of the world's traditions. And any of us who says, I'm not going to read work in that tradition, is being as irresponsible as somebody who says, no, I won't read books that were published on Thursdays. We do much better as citizens of a world to really read across the world that we live in. I'm thinking particularly Sufi strains of Islam with Hindu traditions, especially Neo-Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. And if we look at the history of philosophy in India, starting in the Mughal period, where we get a great deal of interaction between Islamic scholars and Hindu scholars. There's so much communication between Islamic and Hindu scholars for hundreds and hundreds of years, because a lot of Hindu scholars traveled to Persia to work. A lot of Islamic scholars were traveling to Persia to work. Persia was a big hub. And then the Silk Road, of course. So we see tremendous amount of interaction. And when these people weren't fighting with each other. They were arguing about things. They were debating. They weren't fighting. I don't learn anything by looking in the mirror and listening to myself talk. I learn a lot when I talk to somebody who knows things I don't know and believes things I don't believe and challenges my own views. So that Buddhism has traveled from India into Sri Lanka, into Cambodia, into Burma and Thailand, into Vietnam, into Tibet, into China, into Korea, into Japan, into Russia and Central Asia, was for a long time in Afghanistan, and now into the West. And as Buddhism has traveled, Buddhism has been changed by the cultures that it's entered, and it's transformed the cultures it's entered. So Buddhism often looks a little bit different in different places, and Buddha just means the guy who woke up. And so the metaphor here is somebody who awoke from the sleep of spiritual ignorance, and we open our eyes and we put down our dreams, which are very delusional. Our dreams are very give us illusions of things happening that aren't real, and we wake up to see reality. Often, if you're an athlete and you're running a race or you're playing football, it hurts if you're working really hard, but you don't suffer. You enjoy that. On the other hand, maybe somebody just slaps you in the face and it doesn't hurt nearly as much as running a marathon. But that's suffering when somebody slaps you. And the difference is the attitude. The difference is the aversion. And the Buddha argued that the attraction and aversion that give rise to suffering are conditioned by what he called primal confusion, thinking of ourselves as independent agents who stand against the world, rather than as interdependent beings with everybody in the world. The second, impermanence, that everything is impermanent and constantly changing. Nothing retains its nature or its status for any length of time. Even mountains erode. Even oceans rise and fall. And the word nirvana is again a metaphorical word. Most of the words in Buddhism are metaphorical. And what it literally means is blowing out a candle or blowing out a flame. So the metaphor is that we lead our lives as though we're on fire, as though we're burning. And what nirvana is the cooling of that desire, the cooling of that aversion, and the attainment of a particular calm. And to think about anything that we achieve, not as something that I achieve, but as something that was achieved by countless numbers of people and beings through me. Mm-hmm. And that turns me only into an instrument of a vast causal nexus, not an autonomous locus of will. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very different perspective. That theistically motivated religious Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and atheistically motivated Buddhists end up in roughly the same place ethically. And we think about generosity. Buddhists emphasize that when we cultivate generosity, it's not so much because it benefits others. It's because it makes us better people by removing our attachment to our own goods, to our own bodies, to our own time, to our own learning. So that they say that a bodhisattva, somebody who aspires for awakening, has to be prepared to give up everything. But the best way to cultivate patience is to remember when somebody does something unpleasant or wrong or harmful to you, or when you do something unpleasant or unsuccessful, to remember that those are caused by countless sets of causes and conditions. not by free will. You don't blame people for them, you feel sorry for them. So when somebody does something unpleasant to me, what I should be doing is not becoming angry, but thinking, that poor man, that he behaves like that. Something really horrible must be happening in his mind. What could I do to help him? Rather than, how can I punish him? And the Buddha argues that there are thousands of kleshas, thousands of little psychopathologies, and that we are full of them, each one of us. And that our task is to gradually reduce those. It's a putting out of the fires that afflict us. I don't cease to exist in nirvana, but I cease to be burning. I cease to be burning with attraction and aversion, with greed and with hatred. I cease to be burning with confusion. I'm cooled down. I'm calm from being just immediately reactive and not thinking, or to being open and careful and responsive to the needs of others. That's what nirvana looks like. And in that state, I'm giving up on my ego. And that is where the analogy to Sufism also is. My psychopathologies are caused by ego grasping. And the more that I can let go of the sense that I'm an ego, the better a human being I can be. Dogs see them the way dogs see them. Bees have a bee world. I've got my world. But that's not how we think, right? So we're constantly going through a world thinking that it's just the way it's delivered to us, and then building our knowledge on top of that. And so the question is, given that we know that our knowledge is built on massive illusion, can we actually know anything at all? And so Tibetans debated this for a very long time.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. Today we are interviewing Professor Jay Garfield. He's a professor of philosophy who specializes in Tibetan Buddhism. He also specializes on philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and ethics. He's a visiting professor of Buddhist philosophy at Harvard Divinity School and a professor of philosophy at Melbourne University. He's an editor in Philosophical Psychology, Journal of Indian Philosophy and Religion, and also American Institute of Buddhist Studies and the Journal of Buddhist Philosophy. He had several publications such as Losing Ourselves, Learning to Live Without a Self, Buddhist Ethics, a Philosophical Exploration, Engaging Buddhism, Why Does Buddhism Matter to Philosophy, Buddhist Ethics we mentioned, and also Empty Words, Buddhist Philosophy and Cross-Cultural Interpretation, and also Indian Philosophy in English. So welcome, Doctor, and it's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So in the beginning, tell us more about yourself, the mystery and secret beyond your love, dedication, and long studies in philosophy, philosophy of language, and Buddhist philosophy and mysticism in specific. What's so special and interesting and attracting is in this tradition in general, and we just like to know more about yourself and about your academic or spiritual or religious journey.
Sure. As you pointed out, I'm a professional philosopher. I'm not a very religious person, and I'm not somebody who preaches or is a religious leader in any sense. My interests are academic, and my interests are in the fundamental nature of reality. So when I began my philosophical journey, I did so as an undergraduate student studying philosophy, and discovered very soon that I loved philosophy and that I was fascinated by trying to understand what reality is, what the mind is, what we are as human beings in a natural world, how we come to be conscious, all of those big questions. And I was impressed that philosophy provided a reflective avenue to understanding those questions. But in my philosophical training, like that of most people who study philosophy, all I encountered was European philosophy. Greek philosophy, European philosophy, philosophy written in the United States or Australia or Great Britain, Germany or France. And it was as though the entire philosophical curriculum was European. And I took that for granted, as do most people. But it really bothered me after a while, because it struck me that philosophy couldn't be something that only European people do. It was just too powerful and interesting a human activity. And when I finished my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, where I specialized in logic and foundations of cognitive science, still no introduction to any non-European philosophy. And this is not unusual. This is the way philosophy is taught over the world, not just in the United States and the West, but also in Middle Eastern countries, also in Asian countries, also in African countries. It's taught as though it's a European discipline. But when I started my first teaching job, which was at a small college called Hampshire College, the first student who walked into my office, my very first day of my career, told me that he wanted me to supervise his thesis on connections between issues in medieval Tibetan epistemology and the social contract tradition. And I just laughed. I thought this was a joke because I couldn't imagine anything like this. And he was really upset because he'd been studying Tibetan language hard to do the Tibetan philosophy. He'd been studying French to read Rousseau. He thought he had a really interesting idea, and actually he did. And here was this brand new assistant professor laughing at him. So we got past that, and he assured me that another guy, Bob Thurman, who was then teaching at a neighboring college, would take care of the Buddhist philosophy. All he wanted me to do was to keep him honest on Locke and Rousseau. He asked me, "You can read Locke and Rousseau, can't you?" I said, "Sure, I can do that." So I thought it was a bad idea to start my career by saying no to somebody. So I said, "Sure." And so that meant that I had to read what he was reading. And while I wasn't responsible for supervising the work on Tibetan epistemology, I had to read that. And so my introduction to Buddhist philosophy was reading some very technical work in 15th century Tibetan theory of knowledge, epistemology. And it was very hard to understand because I didn't have the relevant background. I was really jumping in the deep end. And I had to kind of build the background and ask people to tutor me as I went along. But the longer I worked on it, the more interesting it became. And I realized this was actually very, very profound philosophical thought. And so at least one place beyond Europe, it produced good philosophers, namely Tibet and the Indian folks who they were following. But I had a career to get started. And my career was in foundations of cognitive science and logic. So I put all of that behind me. I thought, okay, this is something at least I know about in the back of my mind. And I went and worked on cognitive science and logic. And then a few years later, our college introduced a really, what was then revolutionary academic requirement. And that was a requirement that every student, no matter what subject that he or she was studying, had to pursue the way it was studied in some non-European tradition. That could be Chinese tradition, Islamic tradition, Native American tradition, African tradition, doesn't matter. But the idea was you couldn't just study the European approach to something. And that was true whether it was chemistry or art history or philosophy or mathematics, it didn't matter. And of course, you can't require students to study things that you don't teach. So it was also a requirement on all faculty members to effectively retool or resign. And so I thought, oh my God, I don't know anything about non-Western philosophy. And then I thought, aha, medieval Tibetan epistemology. I could learn enough about that to add a week to my epistemology course, and I will have done my responsibility. So I applied for a grant to learn this, and I basically hired my friend Bob Thurman to teach me enough so that I could pack 1 week into my course. And I did that, and it was really fun, and the students loved it, and it was really interesting. So the next year I applied for a larger grant to develop a comparative skepticism course, looking at Greek and Western skepticism on the one hand, and Indian and Tibetan skepticism on the other hand. And that was a great success. Students absolutely loved it. But by this time, I was running into a problem. And the problem was, remember, this was many years ago. This was in the 1980s. Most of the relevant texts that I needed to read weren't translated yet. And so I would call my friend Bob and say, hey, I've seen a reference to this text. Do you have a copy of it? He'd say, sure, Jay, but it's only available in Tibetan. I'd say, darn. And I call him and say, well, how about this text? This is another one I need to read. He'd say, yes, I have it, but it's only available in Tibetan. So I realized that if my world wasn't going to be circumscribed to a very, very small number of texts in this tradition and only a tiny window into it, I had to learn some language. So I began studying Tibetan, and that opened up a lot more resource to me. And then I had there was an opportunity to go to Hawaii for 6 weeks on a National Endowment for Humanities program to study Nagarjuna, who was a great Buddhist philosopher of the 2nd century, in whom I was very interested. And I thought, well, I'll never be accepted to this, but I should apply. And I applied, and I was accepted. So I got 6 weeks to really study intensively the philosophy of Nagarjuna, and this really deepened my love for Buddhist philosophy tremendously. And I had a sabbatical coming up. And I started asking people, if you want to get serious about Buddhist philosophy, if you really want to learn Tibetan well, where do you go? And everybody told me the same place. They said, you go to the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in India. It's the best place to go to do this. And if you're lucky, you get to study with Geshe Yeshe Tapkya, who's this great scholar. So I applied for an Indo-American fellowship. I thought I would never get it. I got it. So I took my 2 children and my wife, and we went to India for a year. In the early 1990s. And what had started out as just a teaching requirement became a passion, and I never looked back. And so I've been working on Buddhist philosophy ever since. Now, that doesn't mean I don't work on European philosophy. I very much do. And my work on Buddhist philosophy has deepened my appreciation for European philosophy. My work in European philosophy informs my work in Buddhist philosophy. And so I continue doing philosophy wherever I can find it. But one of the things that's done is it's alerted me that these aren't the only 2 relevant traditions. So now I also enjoy reading deeply in Chinese philosophy, though there I don't read Chinese, so it's very difficult. I can only read in translation. Still, I learn a lot. Native American philosophy, I've learned a great deal from. Islamic philosophy, I've learned a great deal from. And so now I've been really spending most of my years arguing and pushing for philosophy as a discipline, both in the United States and Australia, which are the 2 places I work most, but also in India and Europe and other places, to diversify, to really become a global discipline, not a narrow European discipline. So that's a little bit about me and how I came to this.
Very interesting. So you mentioned Islamic philosophy. So what about your interest in Islamic philosophy, whether in Arabic or Persian tradition and history? Did you open a window through that also?
A bit of a window, but a very small one, because I don't read Arabic and I don't read Persian. And I have the terrible handicap of being very slow at learning languages. So when I decided as an adult to learn Tibetan, I kind of focused my energy entirely there. And I know how difficult a language Arabic is and how difficult a language Persian is to start from scratch as an adult. So I don't have a hope of ever gaining linguistic capacity. So I can only read in translation. But what I've been reading in translation has really convinced me of the tremendous importance of Islamic philosophers in interpreting the philosophy of Plato and the Neoplatonists and of Aristotle, and forming a bridge between classical Greek philosophy and modern European philosophy, and sometimes in ways that are not really appreciated. So, for instance, reading Ibn Tufayl, I realized that a lot of the ideas that people have always thought were original with René Descartes in the early modern period in Europe are all cribbed from Ibn Tufayl. And all of the work we think of in terms of subjectivity and privileged access to the mind and proving the existence of God and so forth that we attribute to Descartes, all of that is coming from Ibn Tufayl, for instance. And studying Farabi has been very important to me in trying to look at new approaches to thinking through classical Greek philosophy. So again, I'm not a scholar of Islamic philosophy, and I don't teach Islamic philosophy because I would not do that without knowledge of Arabic and of Persian. But I certainly read what I can in translation, because my view is that there are philosophical insights to be gained from every one of the world's traditions. And any of us who says, I'm not going to read work in that tradition, is being as irresponsible as somebody who says, no, I won't read books that were published on Thursdays. I'm sorry, Thursday doesn't count. That would be insane. And similarly, I think closing our eyes to Buddhist work, closing our eyes to Hindu work. I do a lot of work now on modern Indian philosophy, that is Indian philosophy in the 19th and early 20th century. That's been a central part of my work. And of course, that's not Buddhist. That is primarily a kind of neo-Vedanta that is a fusion of classical Indian philosophy and European philosophy. My view is wherever I can find insights, I want to find them. Mm-hmm. And we do much better as citizens of a world to really read across the world that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We should gain and seek wisdom wherever it manifests. Interesting. So you talked a bit about Islamic philosophy, and we'll talk in detail about Buddhist philosophy, but maybe, and you mentioned that you opened a window through this tradition. So what about Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and Mullah Sadra, and the mystical philosophical approach in Islam, where they talk about the reality of the self, the reality of the human being, and then talking about the ego and the levels that a person should seek until you reach to the higher levels of spirituality or towards God. So didn't you find some commonalities or similarities between this tradition and the deep philosophical Buddhist view, for example?
Not so much. And here's why, but I'll tell you where I do find parallels. So one reason is one enormous difference between two enormous differences between Islamic philosophy and Buddhist philosophy are these. One, Islamic philosophy takes for granted the reality of a self, of an inner person, and is theistic. That is, there's a deity in Islamic philosophy, as you know. Buddhist philosophy is atheistic. There is no deity, no God, and rejects the idea of a self. So the accounts of experience and of spiritual realization in the Buddhist tradition and the Islamic tradition are very different. That doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. There might be good reasons to take serious insights from each, but they're very different. On the other hand, if we look at the accounts of realization in a lot of Hindu traditions, which is a theistic tradition and is a tradition that takes the self seriously, and many, many different levels of realization that we could think of either going up like this or going deeper and deeper and deeper into the self. And thinking of liberation as always involving a kind of union of the self with the deity. The closeness of some strains, I'm thinking particularly Sufi strains of Islam with Hindu traditions, especially Neo-Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, are very, very strong. And if we look at the history of philosophy in India, starting in the Mughal period, where we get a great deal of interaction between Islamic scholars and Hindu scholars, and then moving into the colonial period, the British colonial period, where again, there's a great deal of interaction, partly mediated by the independence movement, but partly just because scholars talk to one another. Between Islamic and Hindu scholars, there you see a great deal of exploration and development of ideas of realization where there's a great deal of affinity.
Mm-hmm. Even yoga and breathing techniques and certain ideas about the unity of being, you can find many similarities between both, and some claim that Islamic Sufism gained too much from Hindu and Buddhist theories.
Absolutely. We should remember that all of these people have been talking to each other for 1,000 years. And when we pay attention to the various Silk Roads, not just the Silk Road through Central Asia, but also the Indian Ocean Silk Road and also the Persian Silk Road, there's so much communication between Islamic and Hindu scholars for hundreds and hundreds of years. And Persia, the Persian court, provided an important core for this, because a lot of Hindu scholars traveled to Persia to work. A lot of Islamic scholars were traveling to Persia to work. Persia was a big hub. And then the Silk Road, of course. So we see tremendous amount of interaction. And when these people weren't fighting with each other. They were arguing about things. They were debating. They weren't fighting. They were interacting in very peaceful, cooperative ways. For instance, if we look at the court of the Emperor Jahangir, the great Mughal emperor, one of the things Jahangir did was have weekly debates at the court between Buddhist, Islamic, and Christian theologians, because there were Christian missionaries there He, of course, was Muslim, being a Mughal ruler, but he was ruling a largely Hindu country. And there were weekly debates on topics about religion and philosophy. And it's reported these were always fierce debates where people argued hard, but friendly collegial debates where everybody took each other's position seriously. So we've got hundreds of years of what I would call collaboration between these traditions. And so there's nothing surprising about the fact that each one borrows insights from the others and that we have real learning in between them. I think that it's very sad when people approach other religious or philosophical traditions as enemies or as rivals or as people who simply have to be defeated. We might not agree about everything, but we can always learn from people with whom we talk. And we learn far more by talking in an open-minded way with people with whom we disagree than we do from talking to people with whom we already agree. I don't learn anything by looking in the mirror and listening to myself talk. I learn a lot when I talk to somebody who knows things I don't know and believes things I don't believe and challenges my own views. Mm-hmm. And that's been the history for a long time. I think it's only recently that people have become pugilistic in this attitude.
The problem is that strict boundaries and prejudice identities keep many obstacles between people and between societies and between religions, and then you feel that they are all competitors or there is too much conflict between them. Rather, we should gain from each other, and we are brothers, and we can complete each other, and we can race but compete but positively, I mean.
That's right. That's right. And even the idea of competition, I worry about in this case. We might disagree and we might debate, but when we debate and disagree, it shouldn't just be because we're speaking to somebody else. We also have to listen. And if I don't listen, then I don't learn anything. And if I simply repeat my own talking points and my own views, I don't learn anything and other people don't take me seriously. But so debate, I think, always has to involve as much listening as speaking. And when we listen, we learn and we change our minds about things. And there's nothing wrong with changing one's mind.
Interesting, Professor, about your own experience. So your special background is different than Buddhism, and you're spending too much time studying Buddhism and Indian philosophy, you mentioned. So you widened your horizons while going through this academic path, transforming from different religious views and social views. True?
Absolutely. So I personally was raised in a religious Jewish family. I'm now not a religious person at all. But if you were looking at my religious background, it would be a Jewish religious background. So in a lot of ways, very similar to an Islamic religious background. All people of the book, most of the same books, and all coming out of the same cradle of the Middle East in our ideology. So for me, coming out of a Jewish religious background, Buddhism looked very different as a religion. And coming out of a Western philosophical background, Buddhism looked somewhat different philosophically, though not as different as you might think. And so the insights that I've gained studying Buddhist philosophy, which have been considerable, have changed my outlook on the world a lot, I think. Have changed my thinking about ethics a lot, I think. And have changed my views about the nature of experience, of consciousness, of knowledge. I mean, all of these things. And I think that my own views have evolved to become closer to those that we find in the Buddhist tradition. Though I'm also critical of parts of that tradition.
Very interesting. I'd like to ask you more about your views about the world, ethics, and consciousness as we delve more into talking about Buddhist philosophy. And I have many questions about the concept of God in Buddhism, the concept of self and spirit in Buddhism, the concept of nirvana, and we'll see how we can cover different ideas in this talk. So in the beginning, and as a summary of your studies in Buddhist philosophy, so what are the main features and characteristics of Buddhist philosophy? So who's the person and what's the meaning of his life? So he's a person, because you mentioned the concept of God has a special definition. So just tell us the most or the main crucial ideas in Buddhist philosophy so we can delve more.
Sure. Now, here's the first thing to bear in mind. The Buddhist world is a huge world with many, many different branches from a single tree. So that Buddhism has traveled from India into Sri Lanka, into Cambodia, into Burma and Thailand, into Vietnam, into Tibet, into China, into Korea, into Japan, into Russia and Central Asia, was for a long time in Afghanistan, and now into the West. So Buddhism has traveled a great deal. And as Buddhism has traveled, Buddhism has been changed by the cultures that it's entered, and it's transformed the cultures it's entered. So Buddhism often looks a little bit different in different places. And because it has a history now of 2,500 years, many different ideas, sects, views have evolved within Buddhism. So almost nothing I say will be true literally of every Buddhist tradition that there is, but I'll try to be as general as I can to try to capture the spirit of the traditions and what they have in common. But bear in mind that there are differences and inflections that we would have to consider. So the Buddhism begins with the career of the person who's referred to as the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. Now, the term Buddha is a past participle of a Sanskrit term, bodhi. And what bodhi means is to wake up. It's a perfectly ordinary term, not a deeply religious term, ordinary term. It's what you do when your alarm clock goes off. You bodhi. And Buddha just means the guy who woke up. And so the metaphor here is somebody who awoke from the sleep of spiritual ignorance and not understanding, woke up, and when we wake up, what happens? We open our eyes and we put down our dreams, which are very delusional. Our dreams are very give us illusions of things happening that aren't real, and we wake up to see reality. And that's the metaphor of the Buddha. So we think of the Buddha as a person who woke up and made progress. He's not thought of as a deity. He doesn't have supernatural powers, just somebody who worked a lot of stuff out. So what did he work out? Well, when we begin in Buddhist thinking, we begin with the idea that the world is permeated by suffering. The Buddha begins with what we call the Four Noble Truths, or the four fundamental truths for anybody who aspires to a noble life, is the way to think about that. And the first is the reality that the world is permeated by suffering. And the Buddha argued that there are three kinds of suffering. There's ordinary evident suffering, things like headaches and COVID and starvation and wars and foolish politicians and things like that cause, the ordinary suffering of everyday life that we're each aware of. And it's not news to anybody that the world is permeated by that, but the Buddha saw that as posing a kind of existential problem. What do we do about it? But the second level of suffering that the Buddha examined was what he called the suffering of change, or the suffering of impermanence. And that has two aspects. One is that for each of us, as our lives change, we're getting one step closer to death, or to disease, or to debilitation, or to dementia. So that each of us, when we think about our life, one way of thinking about a human being is a human being is a corpse in progress. And so when you begin to think about what time does to us, and if I look at you, you're young and healthy. You look at me, I'm an old man. That's what stands in front of you. And all of the ailments of old men. And that's, of course, if you're lucky, because if you're not lucky, one can die young. And so the suffering of change is very, very important. The other aspect of the suffering of change is that even the things that we find pleasant become unpleasant to us after a while. We get bored with them. They get old. They become useless. So change often leads to kinds of suffering. And since everything is constantly changing, I'm constantly changing, you're constantly changing, the weather is changing, the political situation is changing, the climate is changing. Because change causes suffering, there's a great deal of suffering that permeates existence because of that. Third level of suffering, which is the most profound, is the suffering of pervasive conditioning. And this relies on the Buddhist idea, which is the fundamental Buddhist idea, When His Holiness the Dalai Lama was asked a few years ago by somebody if he could sum up Buddhism in one sentence, he said, better, I can sum it up in one word: dependent origination. And that is the fact that everything that happens depends upon causes and conditions, and everything that happens has countless effects. So that everything that we find in the world, every one of our actions, the weather, the climate, everything, the earth rotating around the sun, depends upon countless causes and conditions. When those come together, events arise. When they don't come together, those events don't arise. When I do something, it has countless effects. And that gives us a sense of responsibility, because we know that what we do is going to have countless effects. But it also gives us a sense of gratitude, because we know that who we are isn't something that we made by ourselves. It was brought about by our parents, by our teachers, by our families, by all of the people who went before us. But that pervasive conditioning, the fact that everything is conditioned by causes and effects, means that we're never free of those. We're never in control of our own lives. Oftentimes, parents will tell their children things like, you have to stand, at least in America, not in a Buddhist situation, but in America, you have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. You have to be independent. You have to think for yourself. You have to be original. But Buddhists look at that kind of admonition and they think it's crazy. I mean, what does it mean to stand on your own 2 feet? Does that mean that you've got to make your own shoes to stand in? Does it mean that you've got to make the dirt underneath you that you're standing on? Does it mean you have to grow your own food and make the rain happen that nourishes the crops that you're growing? I mean, it forgets that there is no such thing as independence. We're all interdependent all the time. And that interdependence means that what happens to me is outside of my control. So my life can be affected by a war in Ukraine, or my life can be affected by what corporations do to change the global climate. Or my life can simply be affected by a drunk driver who hits me as I cross the road, or by a disease that I get. All kinds of things can affect my life at any time. And so the third and deepest level of suffering, when the Buddha said that the world is permeated by suffering, is the fact that we don't control our own existences. So the first thing that the Buddha really realized, and the foundation of Buddhism, is that we live in a world that is deeply saturated with suffering, and that forces us to ask, what can we do about that? And how do we live in such a world? So, oftentimes I say, or I hear my students say things like, oh, life is so good. Life is such a wonderful, sweet thing. But then you want to ask them, so you're not bothered by the fact that people are dying in Yemen, or dying in Ukraine, or dying in Turkey and Syria? That doesn't bother you at all. And of course, the moment you think about it, it does. But we as human beings are very good at not thinking about things that we ought to think about. And when we say that the Buddha woke up, one way of thinking about that is that he woke up from the dream that the world is a really wonderful place to the reality that the world actually is a very difficult place and demands a great deal from us. So the second thing that he worked out was that suffering doesn't just happen, it has a cause. And he argued that the cause of suffering for human beings is threefold. Most immediately, it's attraction and aversion. Those are two. Attraction to things we want but that we can't have, like eternal life or eternal health, or control over our own life, or maybe just a nicer car or a better job, or to marry the person who doesn't want us, or things like that, right? Attraction and aversion. That is, not wanting things that happen to us, being upset by them. He pointed out that pleasure and pain are different from attraction and aversion. Pleasure isn't the same thing as attraction. You can find something pleasant, but not be attracted to it. And there's a wonderful Buddhist metaphor that says that happiness in the ordinary world is like licking honey from a razor blade. It's something that's very tempting to us, but underneath it is always suffering. And aversion is different from pain. It's one thing to suffer pain. It's another thing to turn that into suffering. And anybody who's been an athlete will tell you that. Often, if you're an athlete and you're running a race or you're playing football, it hurts if you're working really hard, but you don't suffer you enjoy that. On the other hand, maybe somebody just slaps you in the face and it doesn't hurt nearly as much as running a marathon. But that's suffering when somebody slaps you. And the difference is the attitude. The difference is the aversion. And the Buddha argued that the attraction and aversion that give rise to suffering are conditioned by what he called primal confusion. Confusion about what's really good and what's really a source of happiness. Confusion about who we are in the world. Thinking of ourselves as independent agents who stand against the world, rather than as interdependent beings with everybody in the world. Thinking of ourselves as substantial egos, when we're in fact nothing but continua of psychophysical processes. Thinking that things are sources of happiness that are not. Thinking that things are sources of suffering that are not. And so because our confusion, attraction, and aversion are the roots of suffering, the third truth the Buddha announced was that you can end suffering. And the way that you end suffering is by calming down the attraction and the aversion, by getting rid of the primal confusion. And if you think in contemporary terms, and you think, say, about capitalism and how it works with advertising, we can see all of this in play. Capitalists want us to be attracted to new commodities. Buy the new model car, buy the newest iPhone, get the newest headphones, make sure you travel in the nicest class on the airplane, and so forth, right? It generates advertising that makes us attracted to things that then only cause us suffering, because then we end up spending too much money on these. We end up envious of friends who have them when we don't have them, and so forth. Or advertising leads us to be averse to certain things. For instance, it creates enmity between groups. It creates nationalisms that cause wars, and so forth. So it creates this kind of aversion. And all of that attitude, all of that approach to creating attraction and aversion is by getting people confused, by telling them that things will be sources of happiness, that won't really be sources of happiness, that are just temporary material things. Telling them that things are sources of their suffering, like, for instance, immigrants or people who believe in a different religion or people who speak a different language or something. Well, they're not the source of their suffering, but convincing them that they are. So the idea that confusion rests at the base of attraction and aversion, and those rest at the base of suffering, is something that we can see in our own lives. This isn't so much a kind of religious revelation that you have to believe in. Rather, it's asking you to pay attention to reason, pay attention to your world. And then the Buddha, the fourth noble truth, was what he called the Eightfold Path, the approach to ending suffering. He said, what you have to do is really have a clear, correct view about the way the world is. You have to earn your livelihood in the right way, watch your actions, watch your speech, watch your ability to concentrate, and all of these kinds of things, right? The way you earn your livelihood, and that you can actually work, if you pay attention, to reduce the confusion that you experience and that those around you experience, hence the attraction and aversion, and hence the suffering. So the Buddha argued that the world is characterized by three real fundamental principles. One, we've talked about interdependence, that everything is interdependent causally and conceptually. The second, impermanence, that everything is impermanent and constantly changing. Nothing retains its nature or its status for any length of time. Even mountains erode. Even oceans rise and fall. And the third one of those is the one he called selflessness or emptiness. That when we ask what the essences of things are, this is where Buddhism really differs, both from the Abrahamic traditions, like Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and from the Hindu traditions. Differs very radically. He argued that nothing has any essence. Nothing has any core. Nothing has any defining characteristic. That as persons, we don't have selves. That there's not anything that makes a thing what it is, except the constantly changing set of causes and conditions. So we don't find that permanent core. And those are the three characteristics of reality. And so when the Buddha talks about what genuine happiness would be, what genuine success would be, that's this notion of nirvana, And the word nirvana is again a metaphorical word. Most of the words in Buddhism are metaphorical. And what it literally means is blowing out a candle or blowing out a flame. So the metaphor is that we lead our lives as though we're on fire, as though we're burning. And we're burning with attraction, we're burning with aversion, we're burning with desire, and the burning leads to suffering, because if you're on fire, it hurts. And what nirvana is the cooling of that desire, the cooling of that aversion, and the attainment of a particular calm. So it's a freedom from suffering, not a special freedom to do something. It's not somehow a liberation of power. It's a liberation from suffering, and it's a liberation from attraction and aversion by being a liberation from primal confusion. So there's a quick introduction to the fundamental Buddhist.
Very interesting. I have many questions, so let us be more in a debate so we can gain more from your knowledge and insights. So in the point of independence, so you said in some cultures they say be yourself, stand on your hands, and so on and so forth. So maybe they mean be yourself in the area that you have your free will, to the extent that you can do. They're not talking about controlling things that you can't control, like the rain or like your age or like your name. Obviously, there are many things that you can't control, and you're independent in them. But you have certain area which you can control, which you have your own decision, which you can change your life in. So here where they talk, and I guess you almost answered the questions, and in the philosophy of ethics in Buddhism, they talk about how you get rid of your ego and how you reach the nirvana. So maybe they mean in this area that you can change it. True?
No, that's a good question. And so let me give you a Buddhist perspective on that that's slightly different from the Abrahamic perspectives. The first one is that the notion of a free will is one that, of course, comes pretty late into the Western tradition, but it's one that does not have a counterpart in Buddhism. That is, in Sanskrit literature, and Buddhism is basically an Indian tradition, there is no word that we can really translate as will. That's a kind of idea that comes up in Semitic religions, doesn't come up in Indian religions. But more than that, when we think about the way that the idea of freedom in that sense comes up in the Abrahamic traditions, it comes up as a kind of exemption of human action from the realm of causality. And Buddhists don't think that there is any sense in which we are exempted from causality. So they believe that everything that we do is causally determined as well. And so that's why they would say this idea you have to be completely independent is crazy. That everything, when I perform an action, like suppose I just want to raise my arm like that, the raising of my arm is caused by my intention to raise the arm. The intention to raise my arm was caused by my wanting a good philosophical example. My wanting that good philosophical example was caused by you asking me a very difficult and interesting question. Your asking me that question was caused by my talking a lot about Buddhism. My talking a lot about Buddhism was caused by your asking me to do, and so forth. That we have all of these causes and conditions. And that if we think about ourselves, not as free agents, but as parts of an interdependent causal nexus, Buddhists think that we've got a more realistic view of who we are. And that means that when I decide that I want to transform my understanding, when I want to reduce my attraction and aversion, that when I want to live a more ethically decent life, I can't think of that as something that I just do all by myself. That's something that requires assistance. That requires me, for instance, to study and to reflect. And that means that I'm being caused to do and to think the way that I do by other people who have written those texts. But it means I also talk to my teachers. I talk to my friends. I might talk to my parents. I might talk to religious leaders and to get advice. And that who I become isn't something that I do all by myself. It's something for which a lot of other people are responsible. So one way of thinking about this is that Buddhists ask us to replace an attitude of pride in our accomplishments with an attitude of gratitude to others for enabling us to be who we are. And that's a very different kind of attitude. And to think about anything that we achieve, not as something that I achieve, but as something that was achieved by countless numbers of people and beings through me. Mm-hmm. And that turns me only into an instrument of a vast causal nexus, not an autonomous locus of will. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very different perspective.
So in Greek ethics, or maybe in Islamic or an Abrahamic view, I can here talk about certain ethical concepts like being humble, like having gratitude and being thankful to God or to other people, and like to not to have your ego, or to believe that your success is caused by the grace of God or grace of your teachers and the society, and the feeling humble, and all these ethical factors that you have. But here also, I get the cosmic view that you're explaining about Buddhism, but when we zoom in and we talk about the decision and the free will of a person, here where we notice differences between people, this person is more superior, this person is like this. So here we can notice an issue of a free will or a decision maker, or something or a person who's taking a step, whereas another person didn't take this step or took that bad or wrong step. So here where I know the independence, because in Sufism also there is a very deep concept of independence, and there is nothing that's happening in this existence from us, whether it is from the divine or all the other factors that are controlling this level of existence, which is very down. But also when we zoom in, we can give credit to this person who is also going and taking steps.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that you said, and I think there's truth in each of them. The first one that I think is very important to see is that even if, and even though, the metaphysical foundation of ethical ideas in Buddhism and the Abrahamic traditions are very different from one another. And I think we need to acknowledge that. The ethical values that the traditions share are remarkably similar. So when we look at the central ethical values of Buddhism, the qualities that we are admonished to cultivate, they're ones that one would recognize in almost every religious and philosophical tradition. So the four big ones in Buddhism that are called the Brahma Viharas, or the divine states, are friendliness, kindness, care, the ability, the desire, and the commitment to relieve others' suffering, impartiality, that is a kind of fairness and justice, and a wonderful one called mudita, which means the ability to take joy in others' success, which I think is a very beautiful idea. English doesn't have a word for that, which tells you something about our societies. But those are values that we can see in almost every culture. So when I talk to my mother, for instance, my mother's very Orthodox Jewish practitioner, and we talk about what I do and what she does, and I'll tell her about some things, ideas in Buddhist philosophy, and just say, oh, that just sounds like Judaism. And I'll say, well, yes, the ethical ideals are very similar, but of course the metaphysics is very different. Because it's one thing, and again, this is something that we're going to find as a matter of difference, not as a matter to fight about. But it's one thing to say that who we are and what we become arises from a huge network of causes and conditions. And it's another to say that it's divinely caused. And Buddhism rejects the idea of a divine cause and locates causation in an endless network of effectively automatic causes and conditions. Secondly, it's one thing to say that I actually have a free will when I make choices, and that my actions are independent of prior causes, and another to say that I don't. And so the metaphysical doctrine, the explanation of what the nature of things are, differs tremendously between Buddhism and the Abrahamic traditions. But the moral content that emerges is no different at all. This is something His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said repeatedly in his discussions in interfaith dialogues. He says that while the world's religious and philosophical traditions differ tremendously in their metaphysical views, they differ much less in their practices, and they differ almost not at all in their ethics. And that if people can pay attention to their shared ethical standpoints and to the similarities in their practices, then maybe they shouldn't worry too much about the differences in the metaphysics. And I think that's probably true. So it's an interesting thing that theistically motivated religious Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and atheistically motivated Buddhists end up in roughly the same place ethically, even if they disagree about what the foundation of that commitment is, which suggests that our ethical insights are more universal than our metaphysical insights.
Very interesting, very interesting. I'd like to ask you here about two concepts, and you see from where you start your answer. So about the concept of God in Buddhist philosophy, what's the reality of God? And about, you talked a bit about nirvana and how to reach to the level of nirvana. So what's nirvana is exactly about? Because in the Indian philosophy, there is a concept which is called reaching to complete nothingness. And in Islamic Sufism, we have a level where a person reaches to a very high spiritual level where he, between two parentheses, unites with God, or he becomes a full manifestation of God names and qualities. So there is no, we call it ithnayniya fil bayn, so there is only one reality that stays, or that he doesn't perceive or sees another reality than only the reality of the one. How can we understand the philosophical idea of nirvana? Is it also about getting rid of all levels of ego-ness and the bad desires and the vices to ascend spiritually? So getting rid from anger and all these bad vices, rising spiritually until he reaches to a level where he realizes from his real essence, from his heart. It's a type of knowledge also, if you'd explain it a bit, please.
Sure. And again, I'm going to have to give the caution that there are very different explanations given in different Buddhist schools. So I'm going to give you an example, not a complete picture, because that would take us years, not hours. So here's the first thing to say. Again, Buddhism is resolutely atheistic. So any account of nirvana or of spiritual practice or of non-dual insight, and I want to emphasize that one of the very cool places where Sufism and Buddhism start coming together in interesting ways is in the idea that real insight is non-dual in nature, but their analysis of that non-duality is slightly different. And that's because Sufism is arising in a theistic context and Buddhism is atheistic. So Buddhists think that the idea that there's a God is a delusion, that there is no such thing as a God. And they have reasons for that. And of course, theists have reasons for believing there is a God. So what we can't do is to map exactly, say, an Islamic, or for that matter, a Jewish or a Christian model or a Hindu model of realization onto a Buddhist model, because all of those involve the achievement of some special relation, whether it's identity or direct awareness with a deity. And Buddhism forgoes that and says, no, this is about just ourselves, not about a deity. So that's a big difference.
Sorry for interrupting here, but there's some people who study comparative religion studies. There is a book titled The Common Backgrounds Between Buddhism and Islam. So they try to link certain commonalities in their understanding between both traditions.
There are commonalities, but they're not going to be at that level. So there are going to be commonalities among differences. So part of what I want to do is to underline where the differences are, partly to set them aside, partly to say they're not the most important issues, and that the commonalities survive the differences. And the commonalities are really interesting. So two things I guess I want to talk about. One is this idea of non-duality, or as you put it, unity. I think unity and non-duality are very close to one another. The second I want to talk about are what spiritual progress looks like towards nirvana. So the first is the idea of non-duality. As you point out, great Sufi saints have emphasized that the highest level of realization is one that does not distinguish between me and the world I inhabit, between me and the deity, that where ego disappears completely. And Buddhists would look at that and say, absolutely, because they regard subject-object duality as a delusional superimposition on our consciousness. That when I see an object as distinct from me, what I end up doing is thinking of myself as somebody who is an observer of the world, but not in the world, an agent who acts on the world, but not in the world, and completely different from my objects, instead of completely causally interrelated with them. And so Buddhists argue that the only genuinely accurate awareness of the world has to be a non-dual awareness in which I am part of the world, not somehow standing over and against the world. So that idea of non-duality is common between Sufism and Buddhism as the characteristic of the highest state of understanding. Now, also interesting, when we think about the path towards awakening, and many different Buddhist sects have many different accounts of the path, and I'm going to talk about the one that arises in Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle Buddhism in India, and that goes into Tibet and China. So this is one that's got many different stages. They're often called grounds or bhumis. And each one involves the cultivation of a particular kind of insight and a particular kind of moral perfection. So we begin by cultivating generosity. And again, you'll recognize that each of these virtues is one that you will find in almost any tradition. And we think about generosity. Buddhists emphasize that when we cultivate generosity, it's not so much because it benefits others. It's because it makes us better people by removing our attachment to our own goods, to our own bodies, to our own time, to our own learning. So that they say that a bodhisattva, somebody who aspires for awakening, has to be prepared to give up everything. Material possessions, parts of our body, our own lives, our time and our energy. And as we do that, we release the attachment to self and we release egoism. And so generosity has that function. After generosity, we cultivate a kind of propriety in conduct. Proper conduct that involves mundane things like politeness and kindness and a way of speaking to others that makes us good colleagues, good friends, good citizens. Because again, you can't be an effective agent for other people's welfare if people don't like you and if people stay away from you. So that cultivation of proper conduct becomes really important. And then there's the important cultivation of recollection and introspective attention. That is the ability to recall what our principles and values are and to put them into practice by paying attention to where our mind is at every moment. And that's super important because it's really easy, as you know, as I know, as any human being knows, to profess important principles like mercy and justice and friendship and generosity, and to really believe they're important. But in the heat of the moment, to become angry, to become nasty, to become self-grasping. Now, maybe that's never happened to you, but it's happened to me. And so a very important quality to cultivate, and the next one to cultivate on the path, is this quality of remembering what our values are. And
controlling yourself, controlling your desires, coming calm, and dealing with such difficult situations. It's very hard.
That's right. That's very hard. Then, after you can do that, the next quality to cultivate is patience. And patience here means control of anger. And that means patience with ourselves as well as patience with others. And Buddhists argue that the best way to cultivate patience is to remember when somebody does something unpleasant or wrong or harmful to you, or when you do something unpleasant or unsuccessful, to remember that those are caused by countless sets of causes and conditions, not by free will. You don't blame people for them, you feel sorry for them. So when somebody does something unpleasant to me, what I should be doing is not becoming angry, but thinking, that poor man, that he behaves like that. something really horrible must be happening in his mind. What could I do to help him, rather than how can I punish him? And that cultivation of patience is one that's thought to take a very long time.
Parenthesis, and Dr. You know a bit about psychology. If we analyze different people deeply psychologically, we can notice that if someone gets angry or if someone does a wrong thing, it's because that he had a bad day or something. Someone did bad things. So it's a interaction that is caused from different causes. So you may feel sorry for him if you analyzed him like this and kept yourself.
That's right.
Many few examples are there where people they are personally bad, but in general you can.
That's right. And the Buddhist idea for this, the Buddhist term is klesha, which means psychopathologies. And the Buddha argues that there are thousands of kleshas, thousands of little psychopathologies, and that we are full of them, each one of us. And that our task is to gradually reduce those. So you can think of all of this moral cultivation as psychotherapy, kind of reducing our psychopathologies, and asks us to see that when somebody else is misbehaving, or when somebody else is an adversary to us, to ask ourselves, from what psychopathologies are they suffering? What could we do to help them? Rather than to think, what a terrible person, what can I do to harm them? So patience is next. After that is meditative stabilization. And again, this is a place where in the Sufi tradition, we find a lot of similarity. That is to develop a meditative practice that allows you to solidify all of the other moral qualities you've been developing and to really settle them into your mode of being so that they aren't just theoretical ideas, but the way you take up with the world. And that in turn leads to wisdom or insight. That's the next perfection. Because all of this moral attitude is nothing unless you have deep understanding, and unless you have deep understanding of who you are, who other people are, and how the world works. And after that deep wisdom and understanding comes a kind of openness to others, and the ability to be open and receptive and spontaneous in your behavior. So it's this cultivation of these that's meant to lead to nirvana. Because again, what nirvana is not a state of nothingness. Absolutely not. That's why that fire metaphor is important. It's a putting out of the fires that afflict us. I don't cease to exist in nirvana, but I cease to be burning. I cease to be burning with attraction and aversion, with greed and with hatred. I cease to be burning with confusion. I'm cooled down. I'm calm. I'm able to be a Buddhist Tibetan friend of mine drew a beautiful distinction for me once in conversation. He said, if you pay attention to Buddhist ethics, it's all about the transition from being reactive to being responsive, from being just immediately reactive and not thinking, or to being open and careful and responsive to the needs of others. He said, if we can move from being reactive to responsive, that's what nirvana looks like. And in that state, I'm giving up on my ego. And that is where the analogy to Sufism also is. Because now the idea that I am somehow something special, and that my interests are especially important, and that my harms are especially causes for anger, disappears. The idea that the people who matter are the people closest to me disappears. The idea that the only person I should care about is me and my family disappears. The idea that I shouldn't be friends to people who are different from me disappears. And all of that egoism and duality falls away. My existence doesn't fall away, but it's transformed from an egoistic existence to an interdependent, non-egoistic existence.
Or what we call enlightenment, for example. You become enlightened.
I'm sorry?
What we call enlightenment, so you become enlightened.
Yes. Yes, and the word that I think is better than that to translate the Sanskrit is awakened. Enlightened is a funny word. I mean, it's a very Christian word, in fact. It has this metaphor of somebody shining a light on you, right? But it's really awakening. It's really that we start seeing things correctly, and we're not responding to what's happening in our dreams, but we're responding to what's actually around us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In Quranic terms, we have the term living. So we are all dead before this spiritual awakening.
Yeah.
or before the spiritual awareness. So then we are now alive, because life is not about the bodily life, but it's about the spiritual life. So
That's perfect. Notice how similar that metaphor is, right? It's a metaphor that's taking us from not being aware of what's going on to being aware. A metaphor that takes us from being separate from the world. Because when we're sleeping, we're not, involved. When we're dead, we're not involved. But when we're alive or awake, we're involved in the world. So they're both metaphors about coming to consciousness and involvement. And so neither of them is a metaphor of non-existence. And when people see nirvana as non-existence, I think they're doing a great disservice to the Buddhist tradition.
So let us finalize here, Professor, with nirvana. So nirvana is demolishing or getting rid or deleting the I, the myself, the ego, with all the bad vices and desires that it contains, such as anger, such as the bad deeds that a person does. And instead of that, you are being cultivated with the good features and the virtues, true, and you live a new life which is full of the good things and the virtues.
That's right. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And there's nothing different between the other traditions. They all say the same thing.
That's right. That's what I'm saying, that when we look at the metaphysics, big differences. When we look at the practices, differences, but not huge differences. Then when we look at the values, almost always the same.
Okay, here, what about the concept of God? Because in the Abrahamic religions and what we understand as religious, the people who study religions, there is a God at the end of the day. There is an afterlife where people go to heaven and hell, and there is certain reality. Whereas in Sufi views, God is not a person, but he's the theory of unity of being. So there is a very deep meaning of God, which he manifests and exists everywhere. And we are part of, so we are manifestations of him. But here, how can the religious understanding or theology is based on something that's not there, or how they understand him? So who they seek, who they pray to, what's the ultimate goal of their lives? Just how can we understand it?
So they do not pray to a deity, or because they don't believe that there is one. The Buddhists often do offer prayers, but the prayers are more like attempts to cultivate aspirations and desires. So if I'm, for instance, praying to Avalokiteshvara, a bodhisattva of great care and compassion, I'm not thinking this is a real person who can do something for me. But what I'm saying is, may I be like that? Or prayers to the Buddha are prayers for one's own Buddhahood, for one's own awakening. So they're aspirations that are meant to cultivate and transform our own minds. So the function of prayer in the Abrahamic traditions is to build a relation between me and the deity. The function of prayer in the Buddhist tradition is to transform my own mind and to make me a better person. But there's not somebody to whom I pray. It's very different in that respect.
But obviously the
level is atheistic.
The level of your existence, the level of your spirituality, the level of your ethics is being enhanced, and you're becoming a person, just like the people of other traditions. So which goal you are seeking? There's no certain thing that you are referring to, because also some analysis they say that this is just like the different angels that we have, or the different God names and qualities. So, but at the end, also in Buddhism, there's a unity that unites all these different Buddhas that they are referring to, and in some
each one of them
understand them from our own glasses. I mean,
the best way to understand the various Buddhist deities and bodhisattvas is to understand them as images or manifestations of qualities of mind. So when we think about Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, he's the personification of the wisdom I want to attain. Avalokiteshvara is the personification of the attitude of care I want to attain. The Buddha is the personification of the awakening I want to attain. But what we're always thinking about is what I can do to transform my mind, not what somebody else can do to transform my mind. Because there's nothing on the Buddhist tradition that anybody else can do to transform me. That's through my own efforts.
So when a Buddhist person falls in a problem and he needs someone to save him, or when he's in the middle of the sea, so he calls, or innately he feels towards who?
To nobody. What he asks is, what is my best response to this situation?
So very interesting. It's a totally different tradition.
Very different in that respect.
So here, what about marriage and sex and sexual interaction? Do they have a certain philosophy? Is it a sin, or do they have a certain?
That varies a lot with different Buddhist communities, but also depends upon whether you are an ordained monk or nun versus a lay person. So lay people become married and have sexual relations and have children. Monks and nuns are, in almost every Buddhist tradition, are celibate. And so they are meant to be devoting themselves to the welfare of all beings, not to have partial attachment. It's meant as a way of getting rid of attachment. So Buddhists see families and family life as a kind of network of attachments that generate partiality and that generate the need to earn a livelihood and so forth, that take one away from spiritual practice, and that force one to, be thinking about acquisition and protection and things like that. So they're seen as a hindrance. So it's generally seen that a much easier spiritual life is obtained by becoming a monk or a nun. But not everybody can be a monk or a nun. I'm not a monk or a nun. And so, but so for monastics, sexuality is completely impermissible. But for lay people, it's completely permissible.
What's the philosophy beyond that in depth? Because what about the physical needs? What about being balanced in life? What about reaching to higher levels of spirituality when your certain desires are being fulfilled, so you can have a better balance, or you can really enjoy certain desires and understand them, and you go further. So how they can relate to this?
Okay, so in general, but I want to emphasize that, Buddhists think that desire is a problem, right? Because desire is attraction, and attraction generates suffering. So a lot of Buddhist practice is about reducing desire. There's one exception here, and that is the Buddhist tantric tradition, which is a mystical tradition. And that's a tradition in which desire, including sexual desire and including other kinds of aesthetic desires, is channeled and transmuted into a kind of spiritual activity. Those are for very special advanced practitioners, for yogis. And those tantras are often quite secret, and you require initiation and training by particular kinds of masters. They're not for everybody. And in general, desire is considered to be like dynamite. It's really dangerous, and only highly trained people should handle it. The best thing to do if you find dynamite is get rid of it. And the best thing to do if you find desire is to find ways to reduce it. But some highly trained people can engage in tantric practice, which does channel desire in the service of awakening.
Okay, Professor, why in Buddhism, in Buddhist philosophy, plants and animals are very sacred? What's the philosophy on that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear clearly.
Why in Buddhist philosophy plants and animals are very sacred? What's the philosophy beyond
plants
that?
and animals. Okay. Yeah, the sound went very funny for a moment, and I thought that you said airplanes and animals, and not airplanes. Plants and animals are treated a little bit differently. Most Buddhist traditions don't see plants as sentient, but they do see animals as sentient. And in general, when Buddhists ask about the capacity for suffering and the capacity for happiness, they argue that anything that's capable of pleasure and pain is capable of suffering and happiness. And so when we act for the welfare of sentient beings, that doesn't just include human beings, but animals as well. And that's why in some Buddhist cultures, people are vegetarian, not all, but even in cultures where people are not vegetarian, the idea that taking life when you do it is a problematic thing and something one should not do. Monks and nuns never would do that. So monks and nuns, for instance, in India, during the monsoon season would always be in retreat, because that's when lots of worms and insects are out, and people think that by walking around you could end up killing lots of worms and insects. So time to be in retreat. So Buddhists tend to think of anything that can experience pleasure or pain, that is any animal, as something that deserves moral regard. In the Jain system, not a Buddhist system, a different Indian system, they think that plants are also sentient. And so they also they think of plants in that way. Now, Buddhists, though, do think that we have responsibilities to conserve plants. And that's because they're necessary for the welfare of animals and people. If we destroy our ecosystem, then we destroy our own source of food. And this has to do with interdependence. Buddhists recognize that biological systems, whether plants or animals, are all interdependent with one another. And that if we harm one thing, we end up harming others.
Very interesting.
So there's a big eco-Buddhism movement.
In the last part of this interesting interview, I'd like to ask about Buddhism and modernity. You also have a book which is titled Bringing a Tibetan Debate into Contemporary Discourse. Obviously, Buddhism nowadays faces some challenges. My first question here is why we witness a very widespread of Buddhist practices, yoga, breathing techniques, and Buddhism as a religion in general, especially in the Western countries, Europe and America. And even if you go to tourist places, you will find desks and people who are talking about Buddhism. And why Buddhism? Why not other religions?
I think there's several reasons for that. But I'm only guessing, because I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a real social scientist. But I can always offer guesses, because philosophers are allowed to guess about anything. That's one of the things that we're licensed to do, is make wild guesses. So I would say it has to do with a few things. One is a curious fact that in the 19th century, when certain American and British missionaries and colonialists encountered Buddhism in Sri Lanka and India and Burma, they decided, and these are people like Alcott and Uspensky and people like that, they decided that Buddhism was the scientific religion. And this was a kind of marriage of convenience, because the people in Sri Lanka and Burma, places like that, were happy to be seen by these colonizing powers as scientific, because that gave them a way to gain respect and to gain a little bit more authority. And the Westerners coming in were very happy to be able to justify the colonial enterprise by bringing a really scientific religion back to the West. And so whether or not Buddhism was genuinely scientific, people in the 19th century decided that it was. And that idea has persisted. And so as modernity and postmodernity have become more interested in science, the relation between Buddhism and science has helped it. So we have all of this kind of cognitive science and neuroscience of meditation. We have things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based pain management, and so forth. And so we get this kind of unity of classical Buddhist practices, or modern Buddhist practices sometimes, with modern medicine and modern psychology and neuroscience. So I think that's helped Buddhism a lot, because people think if it's scientific, it must be good. If it's scientific, it must be true. So they go after it. That's one reason. Second reason, a lot of Buddhist practices promise a kind of calm or equanimity. And the modern and postmodern world is a world of anxiety, pressure, hustle and bustle, and so forth. And a lot of people are looking for any practice that's going to give them some calm and serenity. And they turn to Buddhist meditation practices because they promise that. A third reason, I think another very important one in the West, is that as belief in God has declined, and faith in Christianity and Judaism, and I don't know about Islamic communities so much in the West, but I think even there, a kind of decrease in religiosity. People want something to replace that. And they like the atheism of Buddhism. They like the idea that they can have a spiritual life, and a life where they cultivate moral virtue, and they cultivate some kind of larger sense of themselves and purpose of life without being committed to the existence of a deity. And so I think partly the kind of growing atheism of the West has led people to Buddhism thinking, I don't have to give up spirituality to give up, when I give up theism, I can find an atheistic religion. So I think it's a combination of those three, but that's just me guessing.
Very interesting. Doctor, I also had a question about how to be a better person in Buddhism, and I guess you talked too much about this thing. And here, during your very long involvement in Indian philosophy, in Buddhist philosophy in general, I'll ask you, what's the most interesting theme, theory, idea that you find in this tradition personally?
The idea of interdependence and selflessness and the way those fit together. That is the idea that my psychopathologies are caused by ego grasping. And the more that I can let go of the sense that I'm an ego, the better a human being I can be. And that we become better persons, better people, when we give up the idea that to be a person is to be a self. And cultivate a much more decentered sense of what morality is and what human life is.
Interesting. And in your book, Professor, bringing a Tibetan debate into contemporary discourse, you mean these commonalities and similarities that we find in ethics between different societies, or you meant also other ideas?
That one is not about ethics. That one is about epistemology. And that's looking at a very nasty technical debate. I don't mean nasty in the sense of unpleasant. I mean hard, philosophically difficult, technical debate about the structure of knowledge and the reality of the conventional world. That was a major debate in Tibet between the 15th and the 18th century, but still continues. And so what we were doing in those two volumes was translating the major texts in those debates and doing history of that debate. And it's a debate about whether knowledge is possible in the context of massive delusion. So if you think about it for a moment, and again, you don't need to have religious views to recognize this. Most of us are wrong about most things. So for instance, just to make it really simple, when you look around your room, or when you just look at your own hand, you think that things exist in exactly the way that your eyes deliver them to you. You think that things sound exactly the way your ears deliver them to you. But you and I both know that other kinds of animals, for instance, would experience things very differently visually and hear very different sounds. So if you imagine, say, a dog in your room, the dog is going to hear in the high frequency ranges that you don't hear. The dog can smell things you can't smell. The dog sees different colors than you see. And if you were to have a bee in the room, the bee sees so many more colors than you can possibly see and can also see electromagnetic radiation. And if you were to ask, gee, does this room look the way a bee sees it? Does it look the way a dog sees it? Or does it look the way Hadi sees it? You'd say, that's a stupid question. There's the room that Hadi sees, the room a bee sees, the room a dog sees, and those are totally different. Dogs see them the way dogs see them. Bees have a bee world. I've got my world. But that's not how we think, right? So we're constantly going through a world thinking that it's just the way it's delivered to us, and then building our knowledge on top of that. And so the question is, given that we know that our knowledge is built on massive illusion, can we actually know anything at all? And so Tibetans debated this for a very long time and looked at how we could develop a non-foundationalist sense of knowledge, or whether knowledge made any sense. And it's that debate that we're talking about in that book.
So epistemologically, a human being should be very humble and think with a very deep and new Kantian theory even.
I think so. It's really important for us to recognize that our experience is only the way that an organism like us, with sensory apparatus like us and minds like us, experiences. And it's not a direct window into reality. And that we really need epistemic humility as well as moral humility. Humility may be the most important quality to cultivate. And it's one of the hardest qualities to cultivate. because then you suddenly start getting really proud of how humble you are, and then you're in big trouble.
And all this stuff, what the mystical and Sufi views and all religions talked about, and they talked about also enhancing a new type of knowledge, which is not only limited to senses and logic and reason, but rather to a very open, deep, existential, spiritual type of realizing things also.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we should be,
please.
I'm saying, so we should be just deeply respectful of all of these traditions and realize that they're converging on many profoundly shared insights, despite their different points of departure.
What's the main weakness epistemologically or philosophically that you encountered in the Buddhist tradition?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's the idea that omniscience is a realistic possibility for human beings, and the idea that Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, was in an important sense omniscient. I think the idea that we can actually even aspire to know everything is a problem. I don't think we're that good, and I don't think we can become that good.
Being full and being full while you're a human being, which is limited, is a very difficult thing.
It is. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this interesting interview and insights about Buddhist philosophy and about your experience, Professor.
It's been a real pleasure, and I'm truly grateful to you for having me on. I've absolutely loved our conversation.